Thank you, Stella. That was lovely. First of all, I just wanted to say how proud I am to be with you all. It really is kind of ridiculous that I'm here as a comedy writer, but I think that I have in common with all of you the fact that our lives didn't quite turn out the way we thought they would. So I hope this isn't too long or too pompous. I thought I was on at 7, and then I got 3 hours writing time taken away from me, which is fine, I think it's okay. So I hope you enjoy it, and thank you for coming. To begin, I would like you to picture a sunny day in a park in San Francisco. Spring has sprung, and a group of children are collecting flowers. Their teacher instructs them to pick a few that they can take home to their parents, and they flutter towards the nearby constellations of bright red blossoms. It's all very wholesome. Sadly, the children have the misfortune to be in the 1978 remake of the film Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The flowers they're bringing home to their parents will be placed in vases, or vases if you're American, on windowsills next to beds. As night falls and the family sleeps, the flowers bloom, releasing minute spores into the air. These spores, fine as dust, settle on each family member, sinking into pores, entering through slightly parted lips. As the night wears on, tendrils emerge from the flowers, extending across rooms, under doors, and attaching to each family member, by now lost in a profound sleep. As dawn breaks, near where each person slept, there's now a pod-like form growing rapidly. Inside, a perfect copy of each family member takes shape, while the originals turn to dust. The new beings awaken, identical in every way to those they've replaced, except now they're driven by one purpose only: to further the spread of these pretty scarlet flowers. Now, here's the really frightening thing about that part of the film. It takes place at the start. So when you see it a second time, you realize that Donald Sutherland, Brooke Adams, and the rest of the cast never had a chance. Their fate was sealed before the film began, and the 2 hours spent running, fighting, and hiding was all just an exercise in futility. I thought again of this scene on a recent visit to Ireland, where I found myself in Dáil Éireann with a group of conservative politicians and intellectuals. Just a few years earlier, we were at each other's throats during the lead up to the abortion referendum. Now we found ourselves on the same side, fighting the grotesque form of American cultural imperialism known as the trans rights movement. During this visit to the Irish Parliament, I heard something that made me shiver. Apparently, the monstrosity that is the Progress Pride flag has been permanently engraved onto a door in the building. A conquering army had planted their flag at the heart of Ireland's legislative power. But this didn't come at the end of a war of words like the abortion referendum, where at least each side was able to make its case. Rather, this was the result of a silent coup, a war fought in whispers and behind heavy closed doors, a war to which the enemy was not invited. The Progress Pride symbol, highly contentious, hated both by feminists and many gay people, now stands as a victory banner in the halls where Irish laws are made. It represents an ideology suddenly beyond questioning or debate. The battle, it seems, is over, and the Irish public didn't even know it was being fought. Of course, the situation isn't unique to Ireland. Like the flowers undergoing the same predatory life cycle in body snatchers, the trans movement has followed its programming in the same way throughout institutions across the Western world. Much like in the film, the process was silent, subtle, and followed an identical template wherever it unfolded. There are still many in Ireland who simply don't know that self-ID is the law of the land. In fact, Irish trans activists were praised in the infamous Denton's document for successfully pulling the wool over the eyes of the Irish public. But I haven't lived in Ireland for nearly 30 years, so for a case study in how institutional capture works, let's talk about the BBC, who once employed me to write television comedy and never will again, which is convenient because I wouldn't work for them. In the last decade, the BBC has undergone a transformation as profound and as devastating as that experienced by the unfortunate characters in Body Snatchers. Its outward appearance may remain unchanged, but its core purpose and duties have been hollowed out. Auntie, as the BBC was once fondly known, now walks in lockstep with ABC in Australia, RTE in Ireland, and PBS in the United States. In New Zealand, the coverage of Posey Parker's Let Women Speak event was so hostile and deranged, so dishonest, that it may go some way to explaining why viewing figures across the media landscape there are in freefall. But back to the UK. In 2013, a group called All About Trans gained unprecedented access to the BBC. They didn't storm the building or stage protests. Rather, they used meetings, workshops, and fun social outings. They met with children's programming and had afternoon tea in the Langham Hotel with Steve Herman. In the same year, the BBC's drama commissioning team spent a delightful day with trans activists at the London Aquarium. Why the London Aquarium? Who knows, but I suspect they lingered at the clownfish. These weren't formal meetings with minutes and agendas. They were casual, friendly interactions designed to build relationships, influence thinking, and most importantly, leave no trace. And it all worked spectacularly well. Just 3 months after the meeting in the Langham Hotel, in November 2013, the BBC's style guide was rewritten. It now included the language of self-ID, effectively enshrining the concept into BBC policy. While we were distracted by the Great British Bake Off, trans activists managed to change the very language the BBC uses to describe reality. The result? A decade of misinformation, misogyny, and bias. When historians are trying to piece together the progress of the trans delusion, they will find in BBC archives a decade-wide black hole, where there should have been robust journalism analysing the progress of an ideology that brought permanent harm to generations of gay, autistic, and gender non-conforming youth. There is instead so much coverage on the activities of drag queens, you would think them diplomats from a nation controlling global energy reserves. Programs like I Am Leo led to a spike in referrals in gender clinics. Victoria Derbisher's show became a platform for unchallenged trans activism. Children's programming began promoting gender ideology to still forming young minds. But it wasn't just about what they reported, it was also about what they didn't. And this brings us to Hannah Barnes and her groundbreaking report on the Tavistock Clinic, when she became one of the first mainstream BBC journalists to report on the medical scandal behind the term trans kids. In a normal news cycle, a story uncovering grave issues at a prominent institution such as the Tavistock would only begin on a flagship programme like Newsnight. After that, the news machine would kick into gear. They'd create shorter versions, maybe a 3 to 4 minute piece for the main bulletins and a 2-minute version for the hourly news updates. The story would be everywhere. On breakfast TV, you'd have in-depth interviews with the journalist and key figures from the report. The 24-hour news channel would run panel discussions, bringing in experts to debate the implications. Online, you'd see a flurry of articles exploring every angle of the story. But that's not what happened with Hannah Barnes's report. In the end, the story was largely confined to Newsnight. The broader BBC ecosystem fell eerily silent on the matter. No cut-down versions for the main bulletins, no in-depth interviews on breakfast TV, no panel discussions on the news channel. It was as if the story had hit an invisible wall. This wasn't accident or oversight. It was a deliberate suppression of information that didn't fit the narrative trans activists had dictated to BBC executives while sipping Earl Grey in the Langham Hotel. The same silent influence which got that ugly flag etched on a door in Dáil Éireann was at work here. The BBC's impartiality guidelines became a weapon against truth. Gender-critical voices were invited onto panels and then disinvited when their opponents refused to debate, killing entire stories. Jenny Murray, the much-loved presenter of Women's Hour, was silenced on trans issues during her time on the programme and eventually forced out. Having started in journalism before my comedy career took off, and now returning to it, I've seen more than my fair share of careless writers, bluffers whose job consists of taking passages from Wikipedia and placing them on the page in a different order. But this wasn't just bad journalism. This was something else. This was deliberately misleading journalism towards an ideological end. One of the worst examples of this was John Ronson's Things Fall Apart, in which Ronson told the story of the Mitchfest Music Festival, which had been a beloved part of the calendar for lesbians and feminists for 15 years. Ronson did not tell the story from the point of view of the attendees. Instead, he zeroed in on the men who had been tormenting the festival goers for years. Ronson depicted Camp Trans as a model of restrained and measured protest, and neglected to mention that its members would drive dirt bikes around the festival in order to drown out the folk acts playing within. Even worse, he failed to include an incident that would have cut the legs out from under his argument. Dana Rivers, a member of Camp Trans, invaded the home of two Mitchfest attendees, Charlotte Reed and her wife Patricia Wright, and killed them and their adopted son, Benny Diambu Wright. Ronson's excuse that he was only interested in the origins of Camp Trans, which conveniently featured no triple murders, holds no water. And in fact, his excuse merely confirms that he knew about the murders and left them out deliberately. That's not just bad journalism. That's a betrayal of journalism. It's a betrayal of the public trust. If a pharmaceutical company was promoting a drug that caused permanent harm to children while suppressing evidence of its dangers, imagine that, we'd demand accountability. We'd expect arrests and prosecutions. We wouldn't just shrug and say, well, that's big pharma for you. How is this any different? The BBC, through its reporting and its lack of reporting, has effectively promoted a medical scandal. They've given a platform to those pushing experimental treatments on children. They've silenced experts warning about the dangers. They've created an environment where questioning the ideology is seen as bigotry, effectively gaslighting an entire nation. Again, this isn't just bad journalism. This is fraud. This is complicity in child abuse. Under the Criminal Law Act of 1977, conspiracy is defined as an agreement between two or more people to commit a criminal act. This includes planning to commit offences against children. I believe that some of the meetings I've described today could fall under this heading. This may sound extreme, but we're dealing with an institutional failure so profound, so damaging, that I feel it demands a legal reckoning, or at the very least, some kind of truth and reconciliation process. We're not talking about a difference of opinion here. We're talking about the deliberate promotion of an ideology that's causing irreversible harm to children, the suppression of evidence that would have reduced the damage, and the ruination of those who tried to stop it. The BBC's reporting has improved somewhat in recent months, although this is an example of what they're still doing. More on that later. But the damage has already been done. A generation has been indoctrinated. Lives have been irreparably harmed, and someone needs to be held accountable. I would suggest that at the very least, the Director General of the BBC should be summoned before the Parliamentary Select Committee for Culture, Media and Sport and made to answer for the channel's behaviour over the last decade. But sadly, that committee includes MP and gender loon John Nicholson, who could take any number of naps near one of the pods in body snatchers, wake up and show no discernible change in his behaviour. As we move forward, we need to demand more from our media. We need true impartiality, not the false balance that sits on truth while feeding on ideology. We need journalists who are willing to ask difficult questions, and we need executives who will protect them from the inevitable Twitter onslaught of anime profiles with she, her pronouns. We need a media landscape that values truth over trends. But most importantly, we need accountability. Those who have used their positions of power to promote harm must answer for their decisions. Only then can we begin to rebuild trust, not just in our national broadcasters, but in every other institution that helps keep our societies healthy. Only then can we prevent future spores of toxic ideologies carried on digital winds from finding purchase in young minds. Thank you. Can I take questions? Sorry? Yeah, sure, yeah, of course. I hope the camera got every bead of sweat running down my face.
So I've thought a lot about that invasion of the body snatchers metaphor, but I guess my question is the frustration I'm having is really understanding why is this happening. So my question is, why did those spores land on such fertile soil?
Well,
what's going on?
Well, there's a number of interesting aspects to that. One of them is the first thing that trans activists did, their first mission, was getting men into women's prisons, because they correctly figured that people wouldn't care about women's prisons or women in prison. And then when they moved on to infiltrating other organizations, they could say, well, look, we have men in women's prisons and there hasn't been a problem. So that was a wedge used to get everything else in. As for why people have fallen for it so completely and so quickly, I just don't know. I will be wondering about that for the rest of my life, especially teachers of young children. I mean, that's the most extraordinary aspect to me, that teachers would do this to children, would deliberately confuse children about the nature of reality, you know?
Right. Great talk. Could you opine a little bit about the difference between omission and commission, and particularly what the press is doing in terms of using both of those methods to suppress truth?
Yeah, well, it's as simple as I said. It's like countless stories about drag queens. I mean, there's been, I think, RIP Nutmeg on Twitter saw that there was about 30 in the last month, you know? It's insane. So these kind of frothy stories about drag queens finding cats in trees are replacing the very real stories that need to be told about why the Cass report found what it did, why the Tavistock was so under the control of ideologues. None of these stories have been investigated. The only people doing it, you know, are people like, obviously, Hannah Gadsby, Joe Bartosh, and me, you know? And I was a comedy writer. I shouldn't be doing it. But there was such a gap that I thought I had to, you know? In fact, it got so crazy that I had to get a friend, JL, who does The War on Women, a weekly roundup of stories, to take care of that, because the stories were coming in at a speed I couldn't believe. Every day features some new outrage. And the press just don't cover it, you know, especially the liberal press.
Hi. Stella said in the plenary on Friday that she thinks we're at the end of the beginning, and that's really struck me. And I was thinking, you've been touring the book and talking to people. People want to come and talk to you about this. Where do you think we are?
Well, in a sense, we're where we always are, in that the vast majority of people don't believe this shit. They do not believe it. And unfortunately, that truth is being, there's a bottleneck formed by the middle-class industries of publishing, theatre, media, broadcasting, and they are stopping the vast majority of people from hearing the true facts behind this. They're still the problem, and that's why I wanted to make this speech today. Not that it will have any impact on the people responsible, but I think really our biggest battle is with the media, because all the facts are out there. Everyone has access to the same facts, but the media are just not covering it. And we need to find out why, and we need to, again, it is sometimes a question of keeping the journalists safe, because the response they get can be, you know, terrible. You have to do, like, I didn't know all this, but we had a business, my wife and I didn't realize that on Company's House, they published in public the address of the business, which was our home address. And that's how the trans activist Stephanie Hayden doxed me, you know, which terrified my wife. And so every person who works on this has to kind of think about their online history, the networks they've created, and try and make them more secure and, you know, just guard against, because, you know, I was a beloved writer, Father Ted. And I thought everything I put online would be treated with the spirit in which it was made. But it wasn't. Like, sarcastic jokes were presented as real. Screenshots of tweets out of context were used were used to prove certain things. So you just have to make sure that you're locked down before you begin. And I think almost there should be a kind of training in media, in the BBC and places like that, to help journalists tell these uncomfortable stories, you know? Yes?
When the BBC had its Jimmy Savile moment, a lot of people came out of the woodwork and said, yes, we knew about it, we just didn't say anything. When do you think the BBC is going to have that moment, and how many people do you think are going to suddenly jump up and say, oh yeah, I did support what you're doing now?
Well, I think the Jimmy Savile moment is ongoing. I often describe this, I just tweeted this yesterday, probably for the 8th time, but imagine a world where every pound shop Jimmy Savile was able to coordinate with every other Jimmy Savile in the world. How would that world look different to this one? And the answer is it wouldn't. It wouldn't look any different. The guy on the screen there is someone who me, J.K. Rowling, Rosie Duffield, Helen Stanlan tangled with online many times. He's now serving 6 years for rape, you know? These people are coordinating. They are, you know, you will see little signs that something is off. For instance, I saw one site today, and it used the acronym minors DNI, which means minors do not interact. This is on Twitter. How are minors interacting with people on Twitter? Minors don't use Twitter. I think that's a signal. I think that's a signal to other people, other pedophiles, saying you can share materials with me. I could be wrong, but that's my guess.
So I agree with what you're saying. The media is to me, the media is the weapon of how they did this, right? And they're very well organised, and they've done it through the institutions and the universities, and they've captured everything. So my question is, do you have or do you know of organisations where we can group together in media to be the solution?
Yes.
Yeah.
And in fact, I know people are here from all over the world, and I would point to the very successful groups SEEN in the UK, SEEN in journalism, SEEN in the civil service. There's a SEEN in publishing that just started. There's a SEEN in retail. So basically, if you form the organizations that provide a place for people to go, they will go, you know?
Hi.
Hi.
I'm in Canada, and about 2 years ago...
I'm so sorry.
I appreciate your passion. About 2 years, and that's what this is about. About 2 years ago, I was in the middle of literally nowhere in northern Canada, listening to the BBC Stonewall podcasts. And
I forgot to mention that, actually. That is another small bright spot in what
right.
the BBC's coverage.
And I learned so much from that. And I thought, wow, if only Canadians could listen to this, because we're seeing this process in all of our institutions, sort of picking off the institutions, picking off individuals, adding on other individuals, and, you know, building these power structures where companies are contracted to provide, you know, rainbow advice and to post, for example, our Canadian Pediatric Society webpage on LGBTQ kids or whatever has all been done by some activist organization.
Gold rush.
Contracted. Right. So my question was actually about that Stonewall series. I find it really hard to find and really hard to share. And I think there's a lot to be learned from it, and I'd love to know what happened to it in the UK sphere, because I didn't hear much.
Yeah, well, again, it just didn't survive long outside the atmosphere of its own show. I believe the producer quit quite soon afterwards, and I don't know whether that was because of internal pressure. I know they also tried to pull a Me Too on Stephen Nolan. That was entirely baseless, so it died a death. So I think, and Nolan, in fact, has become a little bit weird. You know, his position as a kind of debate opponent, he's taking it a little bit too seriously. And I heard him once kind of arguing with a feminist, and I thought, haven't you listened to your own show? You know, so it's very strange the way it was such a great show. It kind of did a brilliant job, and it has no afterlife. Yeah, yeah. So maybe tech people could download it and send me a link and I'll share it. So something like that.
Yeah, I think one of the big problems I find is that what has gone on is so extraordinary and so difficult to explain that people who don't get to hear the voices of the people in this room cannot actually believe that that's what's gone on. And I just wondered how you think we can move to a position where people can actually believe it. Because I know you try to describe it, you have to describe it before you can explain it. And as you're describing it, you can see them looking at you thinking, you're mad, nothing like this could possibly happen.
Yeah.
So, and yet to us, we know exactly what's gone on. So how on earth do we overcome that?
Well, I can't remember who said it, but there's a quote that people go mad in herds and they become sane one by one. So really the best way, I think, is to do... I wish that was mine. I think the best thing to do is to foster more interpersonal connections rather than trusting that the internet will spread the message naturally. I think that emails to friends and family are probably more powerful than we really think, than we know. It really is a thing of connecting. I mean, if everyone in this room connected to 6 people, or even 10 people who they knew, I mean, imagine how exponential the peaking process would become. So I think the personal touch is lacking a little bit. I understand that people are scared of losing their social networks and so on, and I don't really have any advice for that, except judge your own situation, judge how safe it is for you to speak, and start doing what you can. I think, as you say, one of the problems that people have is when you say, oh, they're putting rapists in women's prisons, it's so extraordinary that, as you say, they can't believe it. So they look at the BBC to see if the BBC has written anything about it. And lo and behold, they haven't. So the other way, I think, apart from contacting friends and family, is keep writing to the BBC and institutions like that, wherever you are, and keep complaining and keep pulling them up. When they use the word cis, say, what does that word mean? When they use the word trans, say, what do you mean by trans? Keep asking these questions, because they don't have the answers. And soon, we might be able to exhaust them the way they've exhausted us.
Hi, so I'm from Quebec.
I'm afraid this is the last question.
Yes, I heard it was the last question, so I feel very nervous to have the last question.
Better be good.
Thanks. So my question is, how do we keep on fighting against this movement which comes from the left? And I consider myself a progressive left and a green and whatever since, ever, without falling into the arms of an increasing radical and conservative right. Because I talked to Andrew Doyle earlier. I mean, the people who were telling him he was a horrible faggot or whatever, they weren't coming from the left, they were coming from the right.
Sure.
And I am interested in kind of tracing the middle ground. We cannot go from one extreme to the other. So I think we have to keep our boat, really strictly along. We are for sexual diversity. We are absolutely for, accepting of homosexuality, homoparentality. I don't know if to say that in English. We are against gender identity theory and the capture of children, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's a difficult path to navigate.
Yeah.
So your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. It was a good question.
Was it good?
I think Colin did an illustration of what's happened to all of us, which is that we didn't change. The left changed. The left ran so far to the left that they went out of sight. And we are stood with these conservatives who believe in reality. Now, I don't think believing in reality is a conservative position. So I don't think we need to worry to some extent. I also think that you'll find something else has happened in the last few years, which is conservatives have become a little warmer to feminist thought, feminist theory and feminist activism. Just a little, They're not dismissing feminism in the way they would. They are in America for some reason. In America, they don't seem to see any of the distinctions between different forms of feminism. But in the UK, I just think that some good connections are being made. with people who are often considered, right-wing, but often that turns out to be nonsense. I always worried when I was getting into this that there was a stink around certain people, like Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan. And then I looked into them and I realized it had no basis. It was nonsense, So I think what we might be entering into is a place where we judge each person by their, that cliche, the content of their character. Yeah. So anyway, thank you.